6 of the most disturbing murder cases of the 2000s. Money, power, revenge. What drives a person to take another life? Can evil truly be lurking just beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary people? In the shadows of society, the most horrifying actions are often carried out by those who appear the least suspicious. Today, we dive into a world of darkness, revealing the twisted minds behind some of the most chilling and disturbing murder cases in recent history. Cases that may seem almost unbelievable, but they are all too real. How far can evil truly go? What happens when it's allowed to fester in secrecy? In today's video, we will explore 6 of the most horrifying murder cases from the 2000s, cases that have haunted the memories of those involved and shaped the way we view true crime forever. These are the stories of killers who lived among us, blending into society, until their dark secrets were finally uncovered. From killers hiding in plain sight to those whose crimes shocked the nation, these are the stories that will leave you questioning how deep the darkness in the human soul can go. But the real question is, how many more are out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for their next victim? Long before the chilling stories of the internet age, there was a man whose crime seemed too horrific to believe. Albert Fish, a name that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to speak it. His reign of terror began in the early 1900s, but the details of his dark deeds would continue to haunt the world well into the 2000s. Fish's monstrous acts began long before the term serial killer was ever coined. To those who knew him, he was just another old man, eccentric, perhaps, but harmless. But behind the facade of a kindly, elderly man, lurked a predator whose crimes would forever change the way America viewed evil. In 1928, Albert Fish sent one of his most disturbing letters to the family of his 10-year-old victim, Grace Budd. He described in sickening detail what he had done to their daughter, the innocent child he had lured away from her home. He didn't just kill her, he cannibalized her, committing acts of unspeakable horror that would take years to fully comprehend. Grace was just the beginning. Fish's crimes continued, each one more disturbing than the last. He lured children into his web of lies, telling them sweet stories of adventure, only to lead them to their horrific deaths. But it wasn't just the brutality of the murders that shook the nation, it was the cold, calculating way Fish operated, never once showing remorse for his actions. Fish's twisted mind was obsessed with the grotesque. He didn't just kill, he made sure to savor every detail, every moment of agony he inflicted on his victims. His letters, sent to the families of those he killed, were a chilling reminder of the horrors he had committed. And yet, he remained elusive, slipping through the cracks of the investigation, hiding in plain sight. It wasn't until 1934 that Fish's crimes finally caught up with him. After years of evading capture, he was arrested and charged with the murders of at least 5 children. But his true body count was believed to be much higher. What he had done and the details he freely confessed to was beyond anything law enforcement had ever encountered. At trial, Fish displayed no emotion. He spoke about his crimes in a matter-of-fact tone, as though recounting the events of an ordinary day. His detached demeanor made the entire courtroom uneasy. How could a man who had committed such atrocities appear so calm, so normal? In 1936, Albert Fish was sentenced to death and executed by electric chair. But his legacy, his unspeakable acts live on. His story remains one of the darkest in American history, a reminder of the evil that can lurk behind an unassuming face. And even today, his crimes continue to be studied by criminal psychologists, who seek to understand the mind of a man capable of such horrors. Albert Fish's life and crimes left an indelible mark on America's criminal history. He was a man who hid his monstrous desires in plain sight, and whose terrifying actions will never be forgotten. In the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, there existed a house that had long been the subject of rumors. A house whose walls concealed the horrific secrets of one of America's most infamous killers. His name was Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. A man whose crimes, once uncovered, shocked the world to its core and would go on to inspire some of the most chilling characters in fiction. To those who lived in Plainfield, Ed Gein seemed like just another quiet, eccentric man, strange, perhaps, but harmless. But beneath that unremarkable facade, there was a darkness that festered for years, unnoticed by those around him. A darkness that would not only claim the lives of his victims but also warp the minds of millions who would later learn of his ghastly acts. Gein's first known crimes began in the late 1950s, but the truth about his actions would remain hidden until 1957. That year, a woman named Bernice Worden disappeared from her hardware store. As the community frantically searched for her, authorities stumbled upon something that would change Plainfield forever. When the authorities entered Gein's home, they found a scene unlike any other. The house was a grotesque museum of human remains, furniture made from bones, skin turned into garments, and a collection of body parts that would have been impossible to comprehend if they weren't right there in front of their eyes. The sight of human skulls mounted on the walls, the furniture made from skin, the very air filled with the stench of decay, these were the macabre trophies of a disturbed mind. Ed Gein had a fixation with death, one that went beyond just collecting. He exhumed bodies from local graveyards, and it was not just the remains of his victims he was after. He wanted to recreate his deceased mother, the woman who had dominated his life with an iron grip. His obsession led him to fashion a woman's suit, made entirely of human skin, which he would wear in a bizarre attempt to become his mother. Born in 1906, Ed Gein was raised by a domineering mother who instilled in him a warped view of women and sexuality. His mother, who saw all women as sinful, was the center of his life, controlling him with a grip that suffocated him emotionally and mentally. After her death in 1945, Ed's twisted mind began to unravel, leading him down a path where reality and delusion blurred. Gein's fixation on his mother drove him to seek out the bodies of other women, exhuming them from their graves in an attempt to resurrect her in the most horrific way possible. He believed that by wearing the skin of these women, he could become his mother, and perhaps, in some twisted way, escape the pain of losing her. It wasn't until the investigation into Bernice Worden's disappearance that the full extent of Gein's crimes was uncovered. The police uncovered a string of evidence linking him to the deaths of at least 2 women, though many believe the number of victims could be far higher. His trial was a spectacle, as the country watched in disbelief as details of his horrific acts were revealed. Gein's trial in 1957 revealed the true depth of his madness. He was found guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden and was declared insane, being sent to a psychiatric hospital for the remainder of his life. But the horror of his crimes continued to haunt the nation. Ed Gein became the inspiration for characters in popular culture like Norman Bates from Psycho and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but the true story of Ed Gein was far more disturbing than any fictional creation. Though Gein's house was eventually torn down, the legacy of his crimes lives on. The house, the bodies, the woman's suit, each one a haunting reminder of the evil that can lie dormant in a quiet, ordinary place. Ed Gein's story is a terrifying testament to the darkness that can take root in a broken mind, and the horrors that can be unleashed when that darkness is allowed to fester. On the surface, Philip Markoff seemed like an ordinary man, an aspiring medical student, well-liked, charming, and seemingly destined for success. But behind this carefully crafted facade, lurked a dark and violent predator. In 2009, he would use the anonymity of the internet to lure victims from the most unlikely of places, Craigslist. Markoff's story began with an innocent-seeming ad. He used Craigslist, an online marketplace known for offering everything from jobs to personal services, to find his victims. Posing as a paying client seeking companionship, he met with women under the pretense of wanting their services. But instead of paying for a massage or a date, he planned to attack, rob, and, in one case, murder. Markoff's method was simple yet chilling. He contacted women who advertised services on Craigslist, arranging to meet them in private places, hotel rooms, quiet locations where he could hide in plain sight. What started as a series of robberies would escalate into something far darker. In April 2009, Markoff's first victim, Julissa Brisman, a 26-year-old massage therapist, arrived at the hotel to meet him. What seemed like a typical business transaction quickly turned violent. Inside the hotel room, Markoff pulled out a gun, shooting her in cold blood before fleeing the scene. Her body was found hours later, and the police were left with little to go on. The murder of Julissa Brisman shocked the city, but it wasn't an isolated event. Markoff's spree had only just begun. As investigators pieced together evidence, it became clear that this was no random act. Markoff had used the same tactics to approach another woman, attempting to rob her at gunpoint, but she managed to escape with her life. The connection was made: this was no ordinary criminal. This was a man who was methodical, deliberate, and dangerously calm. Markoff's ability to blend into the crowd allowed him to prey on unsuspecting women, hiding in plain sight as he continued his violent spree. But with every attack, the pattern became clearer, and soon, law enforcement was hot on his trail. The breakthrough came when Markoff's last victim, a woman named Morgan, survived his attack. After being bound and assaulted, she managed to escape, providing investigators with a detailed description of her attacker. This was the break they needed, and the manhunt intensified. In May 2009, after a relentless investigation, Philip Markoff was arrested. The man who had been living a double life, masquerading as a medical student with a promising future, was now in custody. The police had uncovered his identity, and the shocking truth was revealed. Markoff's trial began in 2010, and the details of his crimes were laid bare for the public to see. It was revealed that Markoff had carefully planned his attacks, targeting vulnerable women, using his charm and lies to gain their trust, only to turn violent when they least expected it. His cold demeanor and lack of remorse sent chills through the courtroom, as the families of his victims confronted him. In August 2010, Philip Markoff was found guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. In the same year, Markoff was found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide, leaving behind a trail of horror and unanswered questions. The case of Philip Markoff, the Craigslist killer, reminds us that sometimes, the darkest monsters wear the most ordinary masks. He was a man who seemed to have everything, yet his insatiable violence lay hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to strike. His story serves as a chilling warning about the dangers of trust and the lengths to which some will go to fulfill their darkest desires. California, 1977. A seemingly peaceful suburban neighborhood would become the epicenter of one of the most gruesome and bizarre killing sprees in American history. Richard Chase, later known as the Vampire of Sacramento, was a man whose terrifying crimes would shock the nation and redefine the boundaries of human depravity. What made his killings so horrifying was not just the brutality, but the twisted rationale behind them. Chase wasn't born evil. His story begins with mental illness. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Chase's mind was consumed by delusions that eventually led him down a dark and twisted path. By the time he was in his 20s, he believed his blood was turning to powder, and to survive, he needed to drink the blood of others. But his delusions would soon lead him to murder. In 1977, Chase's delusions became reality. He committed his first known murder in the quiet home of a 51-year-old woman named Teresa Wallin. He broke into her home, killed her, and drank her blood, his first gruesome act of terror. But what made this crime even more disturbing was the grotesque mutilation he performed afterward. Chase didn't just kill, he consumed, he desecrated. And the worst was yet to come. After this first murder, Chase's killings escalated rapidly. He didn't just kill, he drank the blood of his victims and performed horrific mutilations. His next victims were two elderly women, found dead in their Sacramento apartment. Their bodies, like Teresa Wallin's, had been drained of blood, and parts of their bodies had been removed in a gruesome fashion. The community was paralyzed with fear as the killer continued to lurk in the shadows. Chase became known as the Vampire Killer, not just for his bloodthirsty acts, but for the ritualistic nature of his crimes. He stalked his victims in the dead of night, slipping into their homes to fulfill his delusions. The murders were horrifying in their brutality, but also in the way Chase seemed to view them as a means to an end, a twisted way to satisfy his own delusional need to survive. For months, law enforcement struggled to catch the elusive killer. The murders were so violent, so bizarre, that it left investigators baffled. They had no clear leads, and the residents of Sacramento were terrified, unsure of who would be next. It wasn't until January 1978 that Chase's reign of terror came to an end. Richard Chase's final crime came when he entered the home of an unsuspecting victim and brutally murdered two more people. His actions were becoming more desperate, more erratic. But this time, law enforcement was closing in. Chase had left behind enough evidence: blood-stained clothes, bloody handprints that led them to his doorstep. Chase's arrest was a relief to the city, but it didn't erase the terror he had caused. His trial was a shocking look into the mind of a man who had been driven by his delusions to commit acts of unspeakable violence. Richard Chase was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. In 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his prison cell, a victim of an apparent suicide. But his crimes, and the terror he inflicted on the people of Sacramento, would never be forgotten. Richard Chase's legacy lives on as one of the most disturbing killers in American history. His crimes serve as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the depths to which it can descend. A man driven by delusions, he became the embodiment of terror, leaving behind a trail of blood and madness that would forever mark the history of crime. In the vast and seemingly tranquil expanse of Ontario, Canada, 2 men would shock the nation with a murder that would forever change the way we think about brutality. Dellen Millard, the heir to a wealthy family's fortune, and his accomplice, Mark Smick, were not the typical killers we expect to see in stories like this. Their crime was cold, calculated, and committed with terrifying precision. Millard was the son of an aviation mogul, born into wealth and privilege. But despite his family's success, he had a much darker side, one that he kept hidden from the world. Mark Smick, his friend and accomplice, seemed like just another person on the fringe of society, charismatic but unstable, a perfect partner for Millard's darker ambitions. In 2012, the pair devised a plan that would shock everyone. They decided to murder a man by the name of Tim Bosma, a 32-year-old father from Hamilton, Ontario. Bosma was an ordinary man, a hard worker who had posted an ad online to sell his truck. What he didn't know was that the men who showed up to meet him that day had no intention of buying his truck. They intended to kill him. The details of Bosma's death are chilling. The men took him to a secluded area, bound him, and shot him. His body was disposed of in a way that left investigators stunned. But it wasn't just the murder that would haunt people, it was the reason behind it, the complete lack of any remorse or care for Bosma's life. What Millard and Smick didn't realize, however, was that they had left behind traces of evidence, fingerprints, phone records, and surveillance footage that would eventually tie them to the crime. But they weren't done yet. Their next victim would come from the shadows of their past. Laura Babcock, a woman who had been romantically involved with Millard, vanished without a trace. Her disappearance didn't make the headlines initially, but as the investigation into Tim Bosma's murder deepened, authorities discovered that Millard and Smick had murdered her too. They had lured her to Millard's property, where she was killed, her body hidden away for months. They disposed of Laura's body in a way that left investigators reeling. The horrific detail of how she was murdered and hidden away in an industrial burn pit left little for the authorities to find. It wasn't until Bosma's body was discovered that police finally connected the dots, and the full scope of the horror they had committed was revealed. In 2014, after an intense investigation, both Millard and Smick were arrested and charged with the murders of Tim Bosma and Laura Babcock. Their trial was nothing short of chilling. The details of their motives were revealed, showing just how far they had gone to satisfy their own twisted desires. At their trial, the full extent of the horror was revealed. The two men had planned and executed their murders with cold, calculated precision. The lack of remorse from both Millard and Smick was evident as they sat through the trial, showing no emotion as their victims' families spoke. The case was a grim reminder of the evil that can reside in even the most unsuspecting of people. Dellen Millard and Mark Smick's reign of terror ended in 2017, when they were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Their story is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can reside in seemingly ordinary people and how the pursuit of power and control can lead to destruction. They will forever be known as the men who took two innocent lives and as a warning that sometimes, the most horrific acts are committed by those we least expect. Florida. 1989, a state known for its sunny beaches and tourist attractions. But beneath the surface, there was a darkness lurking, one that would soon become the stuff of nightmares. Aileen Wuornos, a woman driven by anger, desperation, and a lifetime of abuse, would soon become one of America's most infamous female serial killers. Aileen Wuornos didn't fit the image of a typical killer. She was a prostitute, a woman who had been mistreated and abandoned by society. Her early life was filled with hardship, growing up in foster homes, enduring physical and sexual abuse. But the most dangerous aspect of Wuornos was not her troubled past, it was the rage that had built up within her, a rage that would eventually explode into a killing spree. Wuornos' first known victim was Richard Mallory, a man who picked her up while she was working as a prostitute. After he drove her to a remote area, Wuornos shot him dead. She later claimed he had attempted to rape her, a claim that would later be scrutinized during her trial. Regardless of the truth, Wuornos did what she had to do to survive. She killed him, and his body was dumped in a wooded area. Richard Mallory was just the first. Over the next year, Wuornos would kill 7 men, all of whom had picked her up off the side of the road, seemingly innocent men with unsuspecting lives. Each murder was brutal, carried out with a sense of vengeance that was driven by Wuornos' deep hatred of men, stemming from years of abuse and mistreatment. Each murder was different, but the story remained the same. Wuornos lured her victims to remote areas, where she would kill them, steal their belongings, and dump their bodies. She was relentless, leaving a trail of death behind her as she crossed the state of Florida, her rage growing with each passing day. Law enforcement was soon on her trail. But Wuornos was clever. She would change her appearance, use different guns, and leave few clues behind. For months, the authorities were stumped. It wasn't until a woman named Taria Moore, Wuornos' girlfriend, came forward that the police were able to make a connection. Taria Moore would eventually turn against Wuornos, providing the police with the information they needed to connect the murders to her. Wuornos was arrested on January 9, 1991, after a nationwide manhunt. But her capture was only the beginning of a legal battle that would captivate the world. During her trial, Wuornos claimed that all of the murders were acts of self-defense. She stated that each of the men had attempted to assault her, and she had killed them in retaliation. However, the jury would later find her guilty of 6 of the 7 murders. The court was divided on whether she deserved the death penalty, but in 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death for the murders of 6 men. Her trial sparked debates about the morality of the death penalty, the psychology of serial killers, and the treatment of women in society. Wuornos' story became a symbol of the pain and trauma that could be inflicted upon someone, and the darkness that could manifest as a result. Aileen Wuornos died on October 9, 2002, after being executed by lethal injection. Her life, a tragic tale of pain, abuse, and rage, left behind a legacy that will be remembered as one of the most infamous in American history. She was a woman who, in the end, was both a victim and a killer. Her story remains a grim reminder of the dangers of untreated trauma, the power of vengeance, and the harsh reality that sometimes, the darkness that lives within us all can consume us. But for those who lost their lives at the hands of Aileen Wuornos, justice was served, though the pain will never be forgotten. As we reflect on the cases we've uncovered tonight, we are left with more questions than answers. What drives a person to commit such unspeakable acts of violence? How does a seemingly ordinary person become capable of such monstrous behavior? These killers, whether they were driven by trauma, mental illness, or a deep sense of evil, have left scars not only on their victims but on society as a whole. From the manipulative Craigslist killer, Philip Markoff, to the brutal vampire killer, Richard Chase, we've witnessed the twisted sides of human nature. These killers, who walked among us, masked by their ordinary appearances, are a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always reveal itself in the way we expect. Sometimes, it hides behind a face we trust, a life we think is unremarkable. For years, law enforcement and the families of these victims worked tirelessly, sifting through clues, piecing together the puzzle of who these killers truly were. The work of the investigators, often in the shadows, cannot be overlooked. For every breakthrough they made, there were still so many unknowns, so many unanswered questions. Why did these killers target the innocent? What triggered their descent into darkness? Justice, though often elusive, is an essential part of healing. It brings closure to those who have suffered, though it cannot undo the pain or restore the lives lost. The families of these victims will never forget the horrors they've experienced, and the scars left by these killers will forever be a part of them. But justice, in whatever form it takes, is a crucial step toward the end of the nightmare. These stories serve as a chilling reminder that darkness can hide in the most unexpected places. But they also teach us something important: the importance of vigilance, awareness, and the need to protect those who are vulnerable. We cannot afford to look the other way when we sense something is wrong. We cannot ignore the warning signs, no matter how small they may seem. We must remember that every life is precious, and we must honor the victims by keeping their stories alive. They were not just statistics in a police report or names in a news story. They were mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. They were real people, and their lives mattered. In remembering them, we ensure that their suffering was not in vain. The darkness that these killers brought into the world may never fully fade, but we can choose to face it head-on. We can work toward a society where such violence is no longer allowed to thrive. We can honor the memories of the victims by remaining vigilant, by standing up for what's right, and by ensuring that justice is always pursued, no matter the cost. Thank you for joining us tonight. Let us remember, let us learn, and let us never forget. As the sun sets on this quiet park, we are reminded of the fragile balance between light and darkness, between life and death. These killers, whose stories we've explored tonight, left behind unimaginable pain and suffering. But in their wake, there is also a call to remember the victims, those who were taken from us far too soon, their lives cut short by individuals who hid their darkest impulses behind the facade of normalcy. The stories we've shared today serve as a reminder of the profound impact these killers have had on their victims and the world around them. But as much as we cannot change the past, we can ensure that the lessons learned from these tragedies are not forgotten. For the families who lost their loved ones, the pursuit of justice doesn't end with an arrest, a trial, or a conviction. It's a lifelong journey. The pain may never fully fade, but it is through their strength, their courage, and the pursuit of truth that we honor their memory. Their stories, their lives, will never be forgotten. Though the killers have been brought to justice, the lives of their victims continue to matter. Their stories are not just cautionary tales, they are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And while we can never undo the horrors they faced, we can work to build a world where such darkness is not allowed to thrive unchecked. Let us carry the lessons of these stories with us. Let us remain vigilant, question what we see, and never allow ourselves to forget the faces behind the headlines. In remembering the victims, we ensure that their suffering was not in vain. We stand not just against the darkness, but for the light that still shines in the hearts of those who refuse to be forgotten. Thank you for watching. May we continue to seek truth, fight for justice, and honor the lives that were tragically cut short. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and always remember justice is not just a word, but a commitment we all must uphold.